In the winter of 1876, in a forgotten corner of the Arizona Territory near a settlement called Copper Springs, a half-starved trapper stumbled into the trading post with a story that made even the hardest men go quiet. He'd been rescued from a blizzard by a woman, an Apache woman who stood nearly 6 feet tall, who moved through the snow like a ghost, and who'd asked him one question that haunted him for the rest of his days. "You've never known kindness, have you?" But this isn't that trapper's story. This is the story of James Holloway, a man who'd spent 5 years hiding in the mountains from a world that had taken everything from him. And this is the story of Nashota Hayes, an Apache woman raised between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, who would walk into his cabin on a frozen February night and change the course of both their lives. What happened next would become the legend that Copper Springs told for generations, a tale of two outcasts who found in each other what the world had refused to give them: a place to belong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at the edge of a pine forest, 2 days' ride north of Copper Springs, where the foothills began their climb toward the Mogollon Rim. It was a rough structure built from ponderosa logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind came from the north. A single window faced east, and the door hung slightly crooked on leather hinges that James Holloway kept meaning to replace but never did. James had built it with his own hands 3 years ago, after he'd fled north from Tucson, with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and a grief so heavy it felt like drowning. He was 32 years old, though he looked older. The mountain sun had weathered his face to leather, and his dark blonde hair had begun to show gray at the temples. His hands were scarred from trap lines and axe work, and his eyes carried the particular emptiness of a man who'd stopped expecting anything good from life. He made his living trapping beaver and marten, selling the pelts twice a year in Copper Springs. He spoke to no one beyond what was necessary for trade. He kept his supplies minimal: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, and his interactions briefer. The townspeople had stopped trying to draw him into conversation years ago. They called him the hermit when they spoke of him at all. James preferred it that way. Solitude was safer than company. Silence was safer than words. The mountain didn't ask questions or offer sympathy or remind him of everything he'd lost. On this particular February afternoon, storm clouds gathered over the peaks, like bruises spreading across skin. James checked his trap lines quickly, pulling in 3 marten and resetting the traps before the snow began. The wind had a bite to it that promised a serious storm, the kind that could bury a man if he wasn't careful. He made it back to the cabin just as the first heavy flakes began to fall. Inside, he stoked the fire in the stone hearth, hung the pelts to dry, and prepared his usual supper: cornmeal mush with a strip of dried venison. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind already planning tomorrow's work if the storm allowed it. The wind picked up as darkness fell, howling through the pines like something alive and hungry. Snow began to fall in earnest, thick and blinding. James banked the fire and lay down on his narrow cot, listening to the storm rage outside. He'd weathered worse. The cabin was sound. He had wood and food enough for a week if needed. He closed his eyes and waited for sleep. He woke to a sound that didn't belong. A thud against his door, heavy and deliberate. James sat up, reaching instinctively for the rifle that hung above his bed. His heart hammered as he listened. The wind could throw debris against the cabin, but this had sounded different, purposeful. Another thud, followed by a voice, low, strained, unmistakably human: "Open." Just that one word, rough with cold and exhaustion. James grabbed the rifle and moved to the door, his breath misting in the frigid air inside the cabin. The fire had burned low. Through the cracks around the doorframe he could see nothing but whirling white. "Who's there?" he called. "Dying," came the response. "Open the door or don't. Your choice." The voice was female, he realized with shock. A woman out in this storm, alone. He hesitated only a moment before lifting the wooden bar and pulling the door inward. The wind nearly tore it from his hands. Snow blasted into the cabin, and with it stumbled a figure wrapped in buckskin and fur, tall and broad-shouldered, covered in ice and frost. The figure collapsed just inside the threshold, and James had to throw his weight against the door to force it closed against the gale. He turned back to examine his unexpected visitor and felt his breath catch. The woman lay on his floor, her chest heaving with labored breaths. Even collapsed and half-frozen, her size was striking. She had to be nearly 6 feet tall, with the broad, powerful build of someone raised to physical labor. Her face was hidden behind a coating of ice and snow, but her clothing told a story. Buckskin leggings and tunic decorated with Apache beadwork, a heavy buffalo robe that had partly come unwrapped, moccasins soaked through with melted snow. An Apache woman, alone in a blizzard, miles from any settlement. James set down his rifle and knelt beside her, his isolation dulled instincts slowly remembering what it meant to help another human being. He pulled the frozen buffalo robe away and saw that her lips had gone blue, her skin gray with cold. She was conscious, but barely, her dark eyes unfocused and glazed. Hypothermia. He'd seen it before in trappers who'd stayed out too long. She needed warmth. Immediately, or she'd die. James worked quickly, his hands remembering skills he'd learned years ago during his time as an Army scout. He dragged her closer to the fireplace, built up the flames until they roared, then began stripping away her frozen outer garments. The buckskin was stiff with ice, her fingers too numb to help with the fastenings. He worked methodically, clinically, removing the wet clothing and wrapping her in every blanket and fur he owned. She mumbled something in Apache, words he didn't understand, then lapsed into silence. He heated water and made her drink it in small sips, supporting her head with one hand. She swallowed reflexively, her body fighting to survive even as her mind drifted. He rubbed her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, wincing at how cold her skin felt. For an hour, he worked, tending the fire, replacing wet blankets with dry ones, forcing more warm water between her lips. Slowly, gradually, color began to return to her face. Her breathing steadied. Her shivers, which had been violent and uncontrolled, began to ease into something more rhythmic. Finally, near midnight, her eyes opened fully and focused on him. They were remarkable eyes. Dark brown, almost black, intelligent and assessing despite her ordeal. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his face, his shabby cabin, the rifle hanging on the wall. "You pulled me inside," she said in English, her voice rough but clear. Not a question, a statement. "You were freezing to death," James replied. "Most white men would have left me outside." He had no answer to that. It was probably true. She pushed herself up to sitting, the blankets falling away from her shoulders. Underneath, she wore only her thin underdress, but she seemed unconcerned with modesty. She looked around the cabin, cataloging everything, the sparse furniture, the drying pelts, the minimal supplies. "You live here alone," she said. "Yes." "No wife?" "No." "No family?" "No." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. Then she said, with a directness that caught him off guard, "You've never known a woman's touch, have you?" James felt heat rise in his face, part anger, part shame. "That's none of your concern." "I didn't mean—" She stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. "I meant kindness, gentleness, the way you handled me just now, getting me warm. You did everything correct, everything necessary, but your hands were careful, afraid, like you'd forgotten how to touch another person without breaking them. James turned away, busying himself with the fire. You needed help. I helped, that's all. Yes, she said quietly. Thank you. The storm raged through the night and into the next day. By morning it was clear the woman, she'd told him her name was Nashota Hayes, wouldn't be leaving for at least 2 days. The snow had piled in drifts higher than a man's head, and the wind continued to howl like something starving. James gave her his bed and made himself a pallet by the fire. She protested weakly, but he insisted. You nearly died last night. You need the rest. Through that first day, they spoke little. James went about his usual tasks, tending the fire, preparing simple meals, checking the integrity of the cabin against the storm. Nashota slept deeply, her body recovering from its ordeal. But when she was awake, he felt her watching him, not with suspicion or fear, but with curiosity, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. On the second day, she was strong enough to sit up and move around. She examined his cabin with the same thorough assessment she'd given him that first night. You've been here 3 years? She asked. About that. Before that, Tucson. Before that, James set down the pot he'd been cleaning. Why does it matter? Because I'm trying to understand what kind of man lives alone in the mountains, speaks to no one, and builds his whole life around not being found. Maybe I just prefer solitude. Maybe, Nashota agreed, or maybe you're hiding. The accuracy of her observation stung. James turned his back on her, staring at the fire. And what about you? What kind of woman travels alone through a blizzard in the middle of winter? The kind who's also hiding, she said simply. That brought him up short. He turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. In the firelight, wrapped in his blankets, she was striking. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but powerful. Her face was broad and strong, with high cheekbones and a jaw that spoke of determination. Her black hair, now dry, hung in a thick braid over one shoulder. Her hands, when she reached for the cup of coffee he'd made, were large and capable, scarred across the knuckles. Who are you hiding from? He asked. The same people you are, Nashota replied. Everyone. The whole world decided we don't fit. She told him her story over the next 2 days, while the storm slowly exhausted itself outside. Her mother had been Apache, her father a white surveyor named Thomas Hayes who'd worked for the railroad. They'd married despite opposition from both their communities and had settled on a small ranch near Fort Apache. Nashota had been raised between worlds, learning her mother's language and traditions, but also her father's skills with numbers and reading. She'd grown tall and strong, unusual for a woman of any heritage. By 15, she could outride most men and outshoot many. By 20, she could manage the ranch accounts better than her father, but her size and her mixed heritage made her an oddity. Apache men saw her as too white, too large, too independent. White men saw her as savage, dangerous, unsuitable for civilized company. When she was 23, her parents died within months of each other, her mother from influenza, her father from a fall from his horse that broke his neck. The ranch had been sold to pay debts. Nashota had been left with nothing, belonging nowhere. I tried to live in Fort Apache for a year, she said, staring into the fire. The Apache women treated me like a curiosity. The white women wouldn't speak to me. Men of both races either feared me or wanted to. She stopped, her jaw tightening. I left. I've been moving north, working when I could find it, camping when I couldn't. I was heading for the Mormon settlements in Utah territory when the storm caught me. You're lucky you found this cabin, James said. Luck had nothing to do with it. I saw your smoke from 3 miles away and walked toward it. Still, you could have died. Yes, she agreed. But I didn't. You pulled me inside. On the third day, the storm finally broke. The sky cleared to brilliant blue, and the sun on the snow was blinding. James went outside to dig a path from the cabin door and assess the damage. The drifts came up past his waist in places. It would take days to make the trail passable again. Nashota joined him outside, moving stiffly but steadily. She looked around at the surrounding forest, the mountains rising white and stark in the distance, the utter isolation of his location. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's lonely," James replied before he could stop himself. She looked at him with those assessing eyes. "Yes," she said, "it is that too." That evening, as they sat by the fire eating venison stew James had made, Nashota asked the question he'd been dreading. "What happened to you, James Holloway? What made you come up here to die slowly instead of all at once?" He should have deflected, should have changed the subject. But something in her directness, in the fact that she'd shared her own story so honestly, pulled the truth from him. "I had a wife," he said, his voice rough. "Anna. We married young, built a small horse ranch outside Tucson. She was pregnant with our first child." He paused, the words catching in his throat like hooks. "There was a raid. Bandits, not Apache. They came for the horses. I was out checking fences. By the time I heard the shots and got back..." He couldn't finish, didn't need to. Nashota was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How long ago?" 5 years. "And you've been punishing yourself ever since." "I wasn't there," James said, anger and grief welling up together. "I was supposed to protect her, and I was checking goddamn fences while she died." "So you came here to make sure you'd never fail to protect anyone again, by making sure there's no one to protect." The accuracy of it hit like a fist. James stood abruptly, needing distance. "You should rest. You're still recovering." But Nashota stood too, facing him across the small cabin. "I know what it's like," she said quietly, "to feel like the world took everything and left you with nothing but a choice. Keep trying and keep getting hurt, or remove yourself from the equation entirely." "And which did you choose?" "I'm still deciding," she said. "Same as you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The snow began to melt on the 4th day, creating rivulets that ran down the mountainside and turned the clearing around James's cabin into a maze of slush and mud. Nashota's strength had fully returned, and with it came a restless energy that filled the small space. James woke that morning to find her already up, reorganizing his food supplies with a methodical efficiency that both impressed and unsettled him. "Your flour has weevils," she said without preamble, "and this cornmeal is nearly rancid. When was the last time you replaced your dry goods?" James rubbed sleep from his eyes, still adjusting to having another person in his space. "I go to town twice a year, spring and fall." "It's February. That means you've been eating spoiled food for months." She held up a sack of beans, examined them critically, then set them aside in a separate pile. "These are still good. The rest needs to go." "I can't just throw away food." "You can't eat food that will make you sick either." She turned to face him, hands on her hips. "You live like a man who doesn't care if he wakes up tomorrow. Your supplies are poorly managed, your equipment is barely maintained, and this cabin..." She gestured around. "It's falling apart. That window doesn't seal properly, the chimney leaks, the door hangs crooked." James felt defensive anger rising. "It keeps me alive. That's enough." "Is it?" Nashota challenged. "Because from where I stand, you're not living. You're just existing. There's a difference." Before he could respond, she'd turned back to the supplies, sorting through them with decisive movements. James watched her work, simultaneously irritated and fascinated. No one had challenged him in 3 years. No one had cared enough to notice how he lived. "I'll help you fix things before I leave," Nashota said, her tone softening slightly. "It's the least I can do. You saved my life. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, but I can't watch you live like this and do nothing." Over the following days, Nashota proved as skilled with her hands as she'd claimed. She re-chinked the gaps in the log walls using a mixture of mud and pine pitch that she taught James to prepare. She adjusted the door hinges using leather strips and wooden wedges, making it swing true for the first time in a year. She climbed onto the roof, her height and strength making the task easier, and repaired the chimney cap that had come loose during winter storms. James found himself working alongside her, taking instruction for the first time in years. She didn't coddle him or speak down to him. She simply showed him what needed doing and expected him to keep up. "My father taught me building skills," she explained one afternoon as they worked together to seal the window frame. "Said a woman who could fix her own home would never be dependent on a man's goodwill." "Smart man," James said. He was. Her hands stilled on the putty she was pressing into place. "I miss him. I miss them both." James understood that particular ache. "It doesn't go away," he said quietly. "The missing, but it gets different. Less sharp, maybe." "Has it? For you?" He considered lying, then decided against it. "No, but I haven't let it get different. I've kept it sharp on purpose." Nashota looked at him with those penetrating dark eyes. "Why?" "Because if I let it soften, if I let myself forget even a little bit, then what was it all for? What was her death for?" "It wasn't for anything," Nashota said gently. "That's the terrible truth. Sometimes awful things happen, and there's no reason, no lesson, no purpose. They just happen. Then how do you live with it? You decide that your life will have purpose, even if their deaths didn't. You build something that honors them by honoring yourself." The words sat heavy between them. James turned back to his work, unable to respond but unable to dismiss what she'd said either. That evening, Nashota cooked supper using the salvageable supplies and some wild onions she'd found growing near the creek. The result was a stew that actually had flavor, seasoned with herbs she'd gathered and dried properly. James ate 2 bowls, surprised by his own appetite. "You know how to cook," he observed. "My mother taught me. Said that food prepared with care nourishes more than just the body." She smiled slightly. She was more poet than cook sometimes, but she wasn't wrong. After supper, they sat by the fire as had become their evening routine. But this night, instead of retiring to separate corners, Nashota gestured to the space beside her. "Sit here," she said. "I want to show you something." Hesitant, James sat. Nashota reached for his hands, turning them palms up in the firelight. Her touch was warm and firm, her larger hands engulfing his scarred ones. "You've hurt yourself," she said, tracing the fresh cuts and calluses. "These aren't old trapper's scars, these are recent, from not caring enough to be careful." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." She reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew a small tin. "This is a salve my mother made. Pine resin, bear fat, and herbs. It heals cuts and prevents infection." She began applying the salve to his hands, her movements gentle but confident. James sat frozen, barely breathing. He hadn't been touched with care in 5 years. The sensation was overwhelming, not painful, but almost too much to bear. "You're shaking," Nashota observed quietly. "I told you, I'm not used to—" "I know." She continued her work, not rushing, not pulling away. "That's why I'm doing this. You need to remember that touch doesn't always mean pain. That gentleness still exists." When she finished with his hands, she released them carefully. James flexed his fingers, feeling the warmth of the salve, the ghost of her touch still lingering. "Thank you," he managed. "You're welcome." The trail became passable after a week. Nashota announced she would leave the following morning, continuing her journey north to the Mormon settlements. James should have been relieved. His solitude would return. His routine would resume. Everything would go back to the way it had been. Instead, he felt something close to panic. The trail is still dangerous, he found himself saying. Another storm could come. It's February. I need to make distance while I can. Nashota was packing her few belongings, her buckskin clothing now dry and repaired. I've imposed on you long enough. You haven't imposed. You've... He stopped, unsure how to finish. She turned to look at him. I've what? You've made this place feel less empty, he admitted. Nashota's expression softened. She crossed the cabin to stand before him. James Holloway, I need you to hear something. You've been kind to me. You saved my life and asked nothing in return. You've let me stay when you could have sent me away, but I can't be your reason to start living again. That has to come from you. I'm not asking you to... Yes, you are. You just don't realize it yet. She placed one large hand on his shoulder. What happened to your wife was a tragedy, but you surviving it wasn't. You're still here. You still have time to build something, to matter to someone, to let yourself be more than just the ghost of what you lost. I don't know how, James said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Then learn, come down from this mountain, go back to Copper Springs, find work, talk to people, let yourself be part of the world again. What if I fail? What if I lose someone else? Then you'll grieve again, and you'll survive again, because that's what living things do, they endure. She squeezed his shoulder once, then released him. I'm leaving at dawn. I hope you'll consider what I've said. James barely slept that night. He lay on his pallet by the fire, listening to Nashota's steady breathing from the bed, and thought about everything that had happened in the past week. She'd blown into his life like the storm that brought her, disrupting everything, forcing him to confront truths he'd been avoiding, showing him how far he'd fallen from actually living. When dawn came, he made his decision. Nashota was saddling the horse she'd recovered from, where she'd left it tethered before the storm, a sturdy pinto mare who'd survived by huddling in a stand of pines. James approached her, his own travel pack slung over his shoulder. What are you doing? She asked. Coming with you, at least as far as Copper Springs. Surprise flickered across her face. Why? Because you're right. I can't hide up here forever, and because... He hesitated, then pushed forward. Because I don't want you traveling alone. The trail can be dangerous. A slow smile spread across Nashota's face. James Holloway, are you trying to protect me? Maybe. Is that so wrong? No, she said warmly. It's not wrong at all. It's actually quite decent of you. They rode down the mountain together as the sun climbed over the eastern peaks. The journey to Copper Springs took 2 days, and they camped one night under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Around the campfire, James found himself talking more than he had in years. He told Nashota about his childhood in Kansas, about learning to track and hunt from his father, about meeting Anna at a barn dance and knowing immediately she was the one. Nashota shared stories, too, about growing up between cultures, about her mother teaching her Apache traditions, while her father taught her to read and cipher, about feeling too big, too different, too much for any world to comfortably hold. I used to think being different was a curse, she said, staring into the flames. Now I think it's just what makes us who we are. The question is whether we let it define us or whether we define ourselves despite it. And which do you choose? I'm still learning, but I'm getting closer to knowing. When they reached Copper Springs, the small settlement buzzed with the usual activity of late winter, trappers selling pelts, merchants preparing for spring shipments, families stocking up on supplies. James felt the familiar urge to avoid eye contact, to conduct his business and leave. But Nashoda walked into town with her head high, and something about her confidence made him straighten his own shoulders. They stopped at the trading post first. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Caleb Morrison, looked up from his ledger and froze when he saw them. "Holloway," he said uncertainly. "That you? Almost didn't recognize you with company." "Mr. Morrison," James said, "I need supplies. Full stock for spring." "And I need work," Nashoda added. "Do you know anyone hiring?" Morrison's eyes widened at her height, her Apache features, her directness. But before he could respond, his wife emerged from the back room. Ruth Morrison was a practical woman in her 50s who'd lived in the territory long enough to judge people by their character rather than their appearance. She looked Nashoda up and down once, then nodded. "We need help in the store," she said. "Heavy lifting, inventory management, dealing with difficult customers. You look capable of all three." "I am," Nashoda replied. "Good. Room and board plus $3 a week. You start tomorrow." Just like that, Nashoda had employment. James felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride that she'd found a place so quickly, fear that she no longer needed his help. They took rooms at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patricia Daniels. She raised an eyebrow at the unusual pair but asked no intrusive questions. James took a small room at the back, Nashoda a slightly larger one on the second floor. That evening they ate supper in the boarding house's common room. Other residents, miners, merchants, a traveling preacher, stared at Nashoda with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. She ignored them all, eating with calm dignity. Afterward, James walked her to the bottom of the stairs leading to her room. "Thank you," she said, "for coming down from the mountain. I know it wasn't easy." "Thank you for making me realize I needed to." She smiled, and in that moment James saw something shift in her expression, a softening, a warmth that went beyond simple friendship. "We should have supper tomorrow," she said. "After I finish at the trading post. I'd like to hear how your day went." "I'd like that too." As James lay in his rented bed that night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, he realized something had changed. The crushing weight of grief that had been his constant companion for 5 years had shifted. Not gone, he suspected it never would be entirely, but no longer the only thing he felt. For the first time in half a decade, James Holloway felt something that might tentatively, cautiously, be called hope, and it terrified him almost as much as it exhilarated him. Over the following weeks, James and Nashoda settled into the rhythms of Copper Springs. James found work as a hunting guide for settlers new to the territory, teaching them how to track game and survive in the wilderness. His years of solitude had made him an expert in mountain survival, and his services were in demand. Nashoda proved invaluable at the trading post. Her strength allowed her to handle tasks that normally required 2 men, and her sharp mind for numbers meant she could calculate costs and inventory faster than Caleb Morrison could check his ledger. More importantly, her calm presence seemed to settle difficult customers. There was something about her quiet confidence that made people think twice about causing trouble. But not everyone welcomed her. Some settlers muttered about that Apache woman working in town. A few refused to be served by her, demanding to deal with Caleb or Ruth instead. Nashoda handled these slights with dignity, simply stepping aside and letting others take over. James watched these interactions with growing anger. One afternoon, after a settler had loudly declared he wouldn't take help from any savage, James followed the man outside. "That woman is more civilized than you'll ever be," James said, his voice low and dangerous. The settler, a thick-necked farmer named Dutch Keller, sneered. "You defending her? What is she to you?" "She's my friend, and she deserves respect." Friend, Dutch laughed. That what you call it? Man like you, alone all these years, must be desperate to... James's fist connected with Dutch's jaw before he could finish the sentence. The farmer went down hard, sprawling in the muddy street. Sheriff Thomas Wade appeared moments later, drawn by the commotion. He was a fair man in his 40s who'd served in the territory long enough to have seen most kinds of trouble. "Problem here?" Wade asked. Dutch climbed to his feet, wiping blood from his split lip. "That man assaulted me." "I heard what you said about Miss Hayes," Sheriff Wade replied calmly. "Sounded to me like Mr. Holloway was defending a lady's honor. Nothing wrong with that." Dutch glared but said nothing more, skulking away with his pride wounded worse than his face. Wade turned to James. "Appreciate you standing up for her, but try to use words before fists next time." "Yes, sir." When James returned to the trading post, Nashota was waiting outside. She'd seen the whole thing through the window. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did." She studied him for a long moment, then smiled, a real smile that transformed her whole face. "Thank you, James, for seeing me as someone worth defending." "Always," he said, and meant it. That evening, during their now regular supper together, Nashota reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm staying in Copper Springs," she said. "I've decided. The Morrisons have offered me permanent work, and Mrs. Daniels says I can rent my room long-term. This feels like a place where I could build something real." Relief flooded through James. "I'm glad. I was hoping you would. And you? What are your plans?" James looked at their joined hands, her large, capable fingers intertwined with his scarred, weathered ones. "I'm staying too. I thought I might buy some land. Maybe start a small horse ranch again. Nothing fancy, but enough to make a living." "That sounds good." "Nashota," he began, then paused, gathering courage. "These past weeks, having you in my life, it's reminded me what it means to actually live instead of just survive. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "A reason to build a future instead of just existing in the present." Her eyes filled with emotion. "You've given me something too, James. You've shown me that being different doesn't mean being alone, that there are people who can see past what makes us unusual to what makes us valuable." They sat together in the lamplight, two outcasts who'd found in each other what the world had tried to deny them: acceptance, respect, and the beginnings of something deeper than either had dared to hope for. Outside, Copper Springs settled into evening. Somewhere in the mountains, James's cabin stood empty but no longer needed. The hermit who'd built it was gone, replaced by a man learning to rejoin the world, and beside him walked a woman who'd traveled through a blizzard to find her place, and had discovered it not in Utah territory but here, in a small Arizona settlement with a broken man who'd learned how to heal. Their story was just beginning. Spring arrived in Copper Springs with the force of a promise kept. The snow melted from the valleys, revealing green grass and wildflowers that painted the meadows in colors James had stopped noticing during his years of isolation. The creek that ran through town swelled with runoff, and the air carried the scent of pine sap and wet earth. James purchased 40 acres of land 2 miles west of town, where the valley opened into grazing land suitable for horses. The property included a decent water source, a spring-fed pond that never ran dry, and enough timber to build what he needed. The price took most of his savings, but for the first time in years, spending money on the future felt right instead of foolish. He began construction on a small barn first, knowing he'd need shelter for animals before he worried about his own comfort. Nashota came out on Sundays, her one day off from the trading post, and worked alongside him. Together they raised the frame, fitted the boards, and shingled the roof with cedar shakes James split himself. "You're good at this," James observed one afternoon, watching her measure and cut boards with practiced precision. "My father and I built our barn together when I was 14, she replied, not looking up from her work. "He said any woman who wanted to own land should know how to build on it." "He taught you well." She smiled, driving a nail with 3 solid strikes. "He taught me that being capable mattered more than being conventional. That independence was worth more than approval." By early May, the barn stood complete, sturdy and square, with 4 box stalls and a tack room. James bought his first 2 horses from a rancher selling off stock, a bay gelding with good bones and a gentle temperament, and a gray mare in foal who'd produce a colt by summer's end. The animals transformed the property from empty land into something alive. James found himself rising early just to feed them, to check their water, to stand in the barn and listen to them move in their stalls. It was the opposite of the isolation he'd sought in the mountains. This was connection, responsibility, purpose. Nashota noticed the change in him. "You look different," she said one Sunday as they sat on the half-finished porch of the cabin he'd started building, eating the lunch she'd packed. "Different how?" "Lighter, like you're not carrying the whole world on your shoulders anymore." James considered this, watching the horses graze in the paddock. "I think I finally understand what you meant that night in my mountain cabin, about deciding that life will have purpose even when death doesn't." "And what's your purpose now?" He turned to look at her, this remarkable woman who'd walked into his life during a blizzard and refused to let him waste away in solitude. "Building something that lasts, creating something good, maybe making up for the years I spent hiding." "You don't have to make up for anything, James. You survived grief the only way you knew how." "Maybe, but I can do better now. I want to do better." Nashota reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. "Then you will." The cabin took shape through May and into June. James worked on it during evenings after his guiding work, and Nashota continued helping on Sundays. It was larger than his mountain shelter. 2 rooms with a proper kitchen area, a stone fireplace that drew cleanly, windows that actually fit their frames, and a covered porch that faced east toward the sunrise. Word spread through Copper Springs about Holloway's ranch. Some folks stopped by out of curiosity, others to offer help or advice. Ben Tucker, a carpenter in his 60s who'd retired from active work, spent a week teaching James proper roofing techniques. Sarah Chen, who ran the general store with her husband, brought cuttings from her garden and showed Nashota where to plant them for a kitchen garden. The community's acceptance wasn't universal. There were still those who muttered about the Apache woman spending so much time alone with a white man on his property. But Sheriff Wade made it clear he wouldn't tolerate harassment, and gradually even the skeptics seemed to realize that James and Nashota's relationship, whatever it was, wasn't their concern. What was their relationship? James asked himself this question regularly as summer deepened. They weren't courting exactly. Neither had spoken words of romance or made promises beyond friendship, but there was an intimacy between them that went beyond simple companionship. Nashota knew how he took his coffee. James could read her moods from the set of her shoulders. They worked together with an efficiency that spoke of deep familiarity, anticipating each other's needs without discussion. And sometimes, when their hands brushed passing tools or their eyes met across the work, James felt something that was definitely not mere friendship. He was falling in love with her. He'd been falling for months, probably since that first night when she'd applied salve to his damaged hands and told him he needed to remember that touch didn't always mean pain. But confessing it terrified him. What if she didn't feel the same? What if she saw him only as a friend, a project she'd taken on out of kindness? What if he ruined what they had by asking for more? The answer came in late June on a Sunday that dawned hot and cloudless. They'd finished the cabin the previous week, and today, Nashota had brought supplies to cook a proper celebration meal in the new kitchen. James had spent the morning installing shelves while she prepared food, moving around the space with the comfort of someone who belonged there. After lunch, they sat on the porch watching thunderheads build over the mountains. The air was heavy and still, charged with the promise of rain. "I've been thinking," Nashota said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The Morrisons have asked if I'd like to become a partner in the trading post. They're getting older, want to step back from day-to-day operations. They'd sell me a third share of the business." James felt his chest tighten. "That's wonderful. You'd be perfect for it." "It would mean staying in Copper Springs permanently, putting down real roots." "You should do it. You've earned it." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Is that what you want? Me staying?" "Yes," James said, the word escaping before he could overthink it. "Yes, I want you to stay. I want—" He stopped, suddenly terrified of saying too much. "What do you want, James?" He could retreat now, keep things safe and undefined, protect himself from the risk of rejection or loss. But Nashota had taught him that safety wasn't the same as living. "I want you," he said quietly, "not just as a friend or a work partner. I want to build this life with you. I want to wake up and know you're part of my day. I want—" He gestured helplessly at the cabin, the land, the future he could almost see. "I want all of it, with you." Nashota was very still. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "Do you know what you're asking? A white man and an Apache woman together openly? We'd face prejudice, James. Criticism. Some people would never accept it. I know. Your life would be easier without me." "My life would be emptier without you," James countered. "Easier doesn't mean better." She smiled then, and it was like sunrise breaking over mountains. "I love you, James Holloway. I've loved you since you pulled me into your cabin and saved my life without asking what I was or where I came from. I've loved you through every nail we've driven and every meal we've shared and every quiet evening sitting together. I love you." James felt something unlock in his chest, some final barrier he'd built against hope and happiness, crumbling away. "I love you too. I have for months. I was just too afraid to say it. And now? Now I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of anything else." Nashota stood, pulling him up with her. She was nearly his height, and when she stepped close, they were eye to eye. "You won't lose me," she said firmly. "I'm staying. I'm partnering with the Morrisons. And if you're willing, I'd like to build this ranch with you, not as your employee or your friend, as your partner, your equal, your wife, if you'll have me." James's throat tightened with emotion. "You're proposing to me?" "Someone has to. You're too cautious to do it yourself." Her eyes sparkled with humor and affection. "Well, what do you say?" "Yes," James said, pulling her into his arms. "Yes, absolutely yes." They held each other as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, and then the heavens opened and the storm arrived in full force. They ran laughing into the cabin, soaked and breathless, and James built up the fire while Nashota found towels to dry off. "We should talk details," she said practically, wringing water from her braid. "How we'll manage two businesses, where we'll live, how we'll handle the people who won't approve." "We'll figure it out," James said. "Together." "Together," she agreed, and kissed him for the first time. The rain drummed on the roof of the cabin they'd built with their own hands, washing the land clean, and James Holloway realized that he'd finally found his way back to living. They married in August in a simple ceremony at the Copper Springs Church. Sheriff Wade stood as James's witness, Ruth Morrison as Nashota's. About 30 people attended, those who'd come to respect Nashota through her work and character, and those who'd watched James transform from a bitter hermit into a man building a future. Some townspeople stayed away, making their disapproval clear through absence. Dutch Keller and his family were notably missing, as were several other settlers who'd made their prejudices known. James and Nashotah noticed but didn't care. They were surrounded by the people who mattered, those who saw them as individuals worthy of respect and happiness. Reverend Joshua Matthews, who'd come west from Philadelphia and held surprisingly progressive views for a frontier preacher, performed the ceremony. His words were simple but meaningful. "Marriage is a partnership of equals," he said, looking at the assembled guests as much as the couple before him. "It requires courage, the courage to be vulnerable, to trust another person with your heart, to build something together that neither could create alone. James and Nashotah have already demonstrated that courage. They've built a home, started a business, created a life. Today, they're simply declaring publicly what's already true. They choose each other, freely and completely." When James slipped a simple gold band onto Nashotah's finger, purchased with money he'd saved from guiding work, his hand was steady. When Nashotah placed a matching band on his finger, her voice was clear and strong as she spoke her vows. "I promise to stand beside you as your equal partner, to build with you, work with you, face whatever comes with you. You gave me a place to belong when I had none. Now I give you my whole heart, freely and forever." James's vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. "I was half alive when you found me. You taught me how to live again. I promise to honor that gift every day, to choose you every day, to build a life with you that's worth living." The celebration afterward was held at the ranch. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food that the community had contributed. Nashotah's employer, Caleb Morrison, had closed the trading post for the afternoon, so everyone could attend. Music came from Ben Tucker's fiddle and Sarah Chen's husband on harmonica. As evening fell and lanterns were lit, James and Nashotah stood together watching their friends celebrate. Ruth Morrison approached, carrying 2 glasses of apple cider. "To the bride and groom," she said warmly. "May your partnership be as strong as your individual spirits." "Thank you, Ruth," Nashotah said, "for everything, for giving me a chance when others wouldn't." "You earned every bit of what you've received," Ruth replied firmly, "and this town is better for having you in it." She turned to James. "You too, Holloway. You came back from a dark place. That takes strength." After she left, Nashotah leaned against James's shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Happier than I thought possible," he admitted. "You?" "Yes, though I keep waiting for something to go wrong. It feels too good to be real." "It's real," James assured her. "We built it. It's ours." They moved into the cabin that night, officially beginning their married life. The small home was simple but comfortable. Furniture they'd made themselves, curtains Nashotah had sewn, shelves James had built to hold her growing collection of books and his collection of trapping and ranching equipment. Over the following months, they developed routines that honored both their individual work and their partnership. Nashotah spent 3 days a week at the trading post, managing inventory and accounts, as the Morrisons gradually transferred more responsibility to her. The other days she worked the ranch with James, training horses, managing the books, developing plans for expansion. James continued guiding work through the fall hunting season, bringing in steady income that they saved toward buying more breeding stock. But increasingly, his focus shifted to the horse ranch. The gray mare had produced a fine colt in July, and James had his eye on purchasing 2 more mares come spring. "We could specialize," Nashotah suggested one evening as they reviewed the ranch accounts. "Focus on breeding horses suited for mountain work, sure-footed, steady temperament, good endurance. There's a market for that with the mining operations expanding. That's smart, James said, impressed as always by her business acumen. We could charge premium prices for proven mountain horses. Exactly, and we build a reputation for quality over quantity. They were good partners in every sense, complementing each other's strengths, compensating for each other's weaknesses, working toward shared goals with shared effort. But their relationship wasn't without challenges. In September, a group of settlers passing through town made crude comments about Nashotah within James's hearing. He confronted them immediately, his temper flaring hot. "Say that again," he demanded, stepping into the space of the man who'd spoken. "Just saying what everyone's thinking," the settler replied, though he backed up a step. "White man married to a squaw ain't natural." James's fist was cocked back when Nashotah's hand caught his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "He's not worth it. He can't talk about you like that. He can talk however he wants. His words don't change who I am or what we have." She turned to the settler, her voice cold and clear. "My husband and I own a successful ranch. We contribute to this community. We've earned respect through our actions. What have you earned besides the ability to run your mouth?" The settler had no response. His companions pulled him away, muttering, and the confrontation ended without violence. But James was shaking with suppressed anger as they walked back to their wagon. "I should have hit him. And proved his point that we're uncivilized?" Nashotah shook her head. "Words from small minds don't deserve our fists, James. They deserve our indifference." "How do you stay so calm?" "Because I've heard worse my whole life. I learned long ago that other people's prejudice is their burden, not mine." She squeezed his hand. "But I love that you want to defend me. Just choose your battles wisely." As autumn progressed and the first snows dusted the high peaks, James realized how completely his life had transformed. A year ago, he'd been alone in a mountain cabin, slowly dying inside, convinced that isolation was safety and attachment was risk. Now he woke each morning beside a woman he loved, worked land that was his, built a future that mattered. The grief over Anna's death hadn't vanished. He suspected it never fully would, but it had shifted from an all-consuming darkness to a tender scar. He could remember her now with fondness rather than just pain, grateful for the years they'd had rather than destroyed by the years they'd lost. And he could love Nashotah fully, without guilt, without feeling like he was betraying Anna's memory. Anna had loved life, had believed in living fully. She wouldn't have wanted him to waste away in the mountains. She would have approved of Nashotah, of her strength, her intelligence, her refusal to be limited by others' expectations. One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after supper, James shared these thoughts with Nashotah. "I think Anna would have liked you," he said. "You're both strong women who knew your own worth." Nashotah was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad you can talk about her. She was part of making you who you are. I don't need you to forget her to love me." "I don't deserve you," James said, not for the first time. "Stop saying that." Nashotah's tone was firm but affectionate. "We deserve each other because we chose each other. We both came from hard places and decided to build something better. That's worth everything." As winter settled over Copper Springs and the ranch, James and Nashotah spent their evenings planning for spring. How many horses to acquire, which bloodlines to pursue, how to market their stock. But they also spent time simply being together, reading by firelight, talking about everything and nothing, learning the rhythms of married life. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, James would marvel at how a blizzard and a frozen woman stumbling to his door had completely changed his life's trajectory, how being forced to help someone else had taught him how to help himself, how opening his door to a stranger had opened his heart to living again. Nashota would be the first to say she'd saved herself, that her survival and success came from her own strength and determination. And she'd be right. But James knew the truth. They'd saved each other. Two people society had deemed unsuitable, unmarriageable, too different to fit. They'd found in each other exactly what they needed. Not someone to complete them, but someone to build alongside. Not someone to fix them, but someone to accept them whole, scars and all. That was worth more than easy approval from people who'd never understood them anyway. That was worth everything. Winter gave way to spring with the abruptness typical of Arizona territory. One week the mountains were still capped with snow, and the next, wildflowers erupted across the meadows in waves of yellow, purple, and red. The creek that ran through James and Nashota's property swelled with snowmelt, providing abundant water for the growing herd. By March of 1877, their second spring together, the ranch had expanded considerably. They now owned 8 breeding mares, 2 stallions, and had 7 young horses in various stages of training. James's reputation for producing reliable mountain horses had spread beyond Copper Springs, and buyers came from as far as Prescott and Flagstaff to examine his stock. But it was Nashota's business innovation that truly set them apart. She'd developed a training program that emphasized partnership between horse and rider rather than dominance. Horses trained her way responded to subtle cues, remained calm in difficult situations, and bonded closely with their handlers, exactly what mining operations and mountain freight companies needed. "You've got a gift," said Marcus Webb, a freight operator from Prescott, as he watched Nashota work with a 3-year-old gelding. The horse followed her through an obstacle course without a lead rope, responding to voice commands and hand signals. "I've never seen training like this." "Horses are intelligent," Nashota explained, rewarding the gelding with a piece of apple. "They want to cooperate if you give them reason to trust you. Most training breaks their spirit first, then rebuilds obedience. I prefer to build partnership from the start." "Apache methods?" Webb asked, his tone curious rather than judgmental. "My mother's people understood animals differently than whites," Nashota acknowledged. "But this is my own approach, combining what she taught me with what I've learned from experience." Webb purchased 3 horses that day, paying premium prices and promising to return. Word of mouth from satisfied customers like him kept their order book full months in advance. The financial success allowed them to make improvements. They built a proper arena for training, expanded the barn, and constructed a small bunkhouse for the seasonal help they occasionally hired. James hired a young man named Thomas Cole, the son of a widow in town, to help with the heavy work. Thomas was 17, eager to learn, and treated Nashota with the same respect he showed James. "You're lucky to work for them," Sheriff Wade told Thomas one day when the young man was in town picking up supplies. "The Holloways run the most honest operation in 3 counties. You learn from them, you'll have skills that matter." The ranch wasn't their only enterprise. Nashota had indeed become a partner in the Morrison Trading Post, and under her management, the business had diversified and grown. She'd established supply contracts with mining operations, negotiated better prices from wholesalers in Phoenix, and expanded their inventory to include items specifically needed by Apache families. Goods that other merchants either didn't stock or charged excessive prices for. "You're bridging communities," Ruth Morrison observed one afternoon, watching Nashota conduct business in both English and Apache with equal fluency, making it possible for people to trade who might not otherwise interact. "Commerce doesn't care about prejudice," Nashota replied pragmatically. "Everyone needs supplies. Everyone has something to trade. My job is facilitating those exchanges fairly." Her presence had gradually shifted the social dynamics of Copper Springs. Initially, some townspeople had avoided the trading post when she was working, but her fair dealing, her sharp business sense, and her refusal to tolerate cheating or price gouging had won over even skeptics. Within a year, customers specifically requested her help with complicated orders or negotiations. The Holloways had become respected members of the community, not despite their unconventional marriage, but through the sheer force of their competence and character. Still, not everyone had accepted them. Dutch Keller remained openly hostile, making disparaging comments whenever opportunity arose. A few families from more recent settlements shared his prejudices, and there were occasional incidents. Crude messages left on their property, whispered insults Nashota pretended not to hear, the social boundaries that some townspeople maintained. James wanted to confront every slight, fight every battle. Nashota tempered his impulses with harder-won wisdom. "We don't change minds by fighting," she told him, after finding an ugly message painted on their barn wall one morning. "We change them by living well, succeeding visibly, and giving no ammunition to our critics." "So we just ignore it?" "We don't give it power," Nashota corrected, already mixing paint to cover the slur. "There's a difference." In April, news arrived that would test that philosophy more severely than anything they'd yet faced. A territorial judge named Harrison Drake was coming to Copper Springs to hear land disputes and review local governance. Drake had a reputation. He was known to be intelligent, incorruptible, and deeply conservative in his views on social propriety. He'd overturned mixed-race marriages in other counties, claiming they violated public morals. Sheriff Wade brought the news to the ranch personally, his expression troubled. "I wanted you to hear it from me," Wade said, standing in their kitchen with his hat in his hands. "Drake's decisions have been challenged before, but they usually stand. He's got influential friends in the territorial government." James felt cold fear settle in his chest. Can he really overturn our marriage? Legally, it's complicated. Your marriage was performed by a licensed minister, properly recorded, but Drake's argued before that such marriages are void as contrary to public policy. Wade looked between them. "I'm not saying he will, just that he could try." After Wade left, James and Nashota sat together in stunned silence. Finally, James spoke, his voice rough with anger and fear. "I won't let him take this away from us." "He may not have a choice," Nashota said quietly. "If the law is on his side, then the law is wrong." "Yes, but that doesn't mean we can fight it and win." James turned to face her fully. "Are you saying we should just accept it? Let him dissolve our marriage without resistance?" "I'm saying we need to be strategic." Nashota's dark eyes were fierce despite her calm tone. "Emotional responses won't win this. We need legal ground to stand on, community support, and a clear strategy." Over the next 2 weeks, they prepared. Nashota researched territorial law using books borrowed from Reverend Matthews, who had a surprisingly extensive legal library. James gathered written testimonials from customers, neighbors, and business associates, attesting to their character and contributions to the community. Ruth and Caleb Morrison organized a petition supporting the Holloways, gathering over 60 signatures, nearly half the adult population of Copper Springs. Sheriff Wade wrote a formal letter describing their law-abiding conduct and economic contributions. Even some unexpected allies emerged. Ben Tucker, the elderly carpenter, gave a passionate speech at the town meeting about how the Holloways had helped him when his roof collapsed during a storm, working for 2 days to repair it and refusing payment. Sarah Chen described how Nashota had nursed her through influenza, sitting up 3 nights to tend her when her own husband was away on business. "These are good people," Sarah declared at the meeting. "They've earned their place here through their actions. Any law that would punish them for finding happiness together is a bad law." Not everyone agreed. Dutch Keller stood up, his face flushed with conviction. It ain't about whether they're nice folks, he argued. It's about maintaining proper civilization. Whites mixing with Indians. It ain't natural. It ain't right. Judge Drake understands that, even if some of you have forgotten. Several families murmured agreement. The community remained divided. Judge Drake arrived on a Tuesday in late April, traveling with 2 clerks and an air of absolute authority. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He set up court in the town hall and began hearing cases immediately. The Holloways case was scheduled for Friday morning. James barely slept the 3 nights before, lying awake beside Nashota, terrified of losing her to a legal technicality enforced by a man who'd never met them. "Whatever happens," Nashota whispered in the darkness Thursday night, "we'll face it together. Even if he dissolves the marriage legally, it doesn't change what we are to each other." "It changes everything," James said bitterly. "It makes what we have illegal, shameful." "Only to people whose opinions don't matter." She rolled to face him, her hand finding his in the darkness. "James, I love you. A judge's ruling doesn't change that. Nothing changes that." "I love you too," he said, pulling her close, "and I'll fight for us, however I have to." Friday morning dawned clear and cool. The town hall was packed, not just with parties to the hearing, but with townspeople curious to witness the proceedings. James and Nashota entered together, dressed in their finest clothes, walking with their heads high despite the stares and whispers. Judge Drake sat behind a makeshift bench, reviewing documents. He looked up as they approached, his gaze sharp and assessing. "James Holloway and Nashota Hayes Holloway," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I've received a petition requesting this court review the validity of your marriage on grounds that it violates public morals and territorial policy regarding racial amalgamation." "Who filed the petition?" Sheriff Wade asked, standing beside the Holloways as their representative. Drake consulted his papers. A Mr. Dutch Keller and 17 other residents of Copper Springs. James felt rage burn through him. He'd known Dutch opposed them, but filing a formal petition to destroy their marriage was an act of calculated cruelty. "Your Honor," Sheriff Wade began, "we'd like to present evidence of—" "I've reviewed your submissions," Drake interrupted. "The testimonials, the petition of support, the business records, all very thorough." He set down his papers and fixed his gaze on James and Nashota. "But they don't address the fundamental legal question, whether territorial law permits marriages between whites and Apache individuals." "The law doesn't explicitly forbid it," Reverend Matthews spoke up from the audience. He'd insisted on attending despite not being called as a witness. "I researched territorial statutes before performing the ceremony." "The law's silence on a matter doesn't constitute permission," Drake replied. In fact, the lack of explicit authorization could be interpreted as implicit prohibition, especially given the clear intent of racial separation laws in neighboring territories. Nashota stood, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Drake looked surprised but nodded. "Proceed." "I'm not just Apache," Nashota said clearly. "My father was Thomas Hayes, a white man employed by the railroad. By blood, I'm half white. Does that matter to your interpretation of law?" Drake's eyes narrowed. "Mixed heritage doesn't necessarily—" "And I was raised Christian, educated in English, taught to read and write and cipher by my white father. I own property, pay taxes, conduct business under American law. At what point do I become sufficiently civilized to be permitted the same rights as any white woman?" A murmur ran through the crowd. This was dangerous territory, challenging not just the specific law, but the assumptions underlying it. "The question isn't your individual qualifications," Drake said, his tone cooling. It's the broader social policy of deciding that some people deserve happiness and legal protection while others don't. Nashoda's voice rose slightly, her composure cracking to show the anger beneath. Of declaring that my marriage, based on mutual love, respect, and partnership, is somehow more offensive to public morals than the drunkenness, violence, and abandonment that occur daily in proper white marriages. Mrs. Holloway, Drake began, warning in his voice. I've lived between two worlds my entire life, Nashoda continued, her words coming faster now. Too Apache for whites, too white for Apache. I've been told repeatedly that I don't belong anywhere, that there's no place for someone like me. Then I met a man who saw me as a person, not a category, who valued my work, respected my intelligence, and loved me for who I am. We built something good together, a successful business, a respected place in this community, a life that harms no one and benefits many. She paused, her dark eyes blazing with fierce conviction. If your law says that's wrong, then your law is unjust, and unjust laws don't deserve obedience. The room erupted. Some people applauded, others shouted objections. Drake banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When the noise finally subsided, Drake's expression was unreadable. That was quite a speech, Mrs. Holloway, passionate and articulate, but passion doesn't override law. James stood then, unable to remain silent any longer. Then what does, Your Honor? Because the people of this town have spoken, more than half support our marriage. Our business contributes to the local economy. We've broken no laws, harmed no one, and lived as decent, hard-working citizens. If that's not enough, then what possibly could be? Drake was silent for a long moment, studying them both. Finally, he spoke. I'm going to take a recess. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. The wait was excruciating. James and Nashoda sat outside the town hall, surrounded by supporters who offered encouragement but couldn't ease the gnawing fear. Ruth Morrison brought them coffee they couldn't drink. Sheriff Wade paced like a caged animal, muttering about unjust laws and overreaching judges. Finally, Drake's clerk emerged and called them back inside. The judge looked tired, as if the past hour had aged him. He waited until everyone was seated before speaking. I've presided over many cases in my career, he began. I've interpreted law according to statute and precedent, as is my duty, but I've also learned that law exists to serve justice, not to replace it. He looked directly at the Holloways. Your marriage was legally performed by a licensed minister. It's been properly recorded. You've conducted yourselves as law-abiding citizens and contributing members of this community. And while there are those who find your union objectionable on racial grounds, there is no clear statutory prohibition against it. James felt his heart hammering. Was Drake going to rule in their favor? More importantly, Drake continued, I find the arguments about public morals to be hollow when the evidence shows that your marriage has done nothing but good for yourselves, for this community, and for the institution of marriage itself. You've demonstrated that commitment, respect, and partnership matter more than racial classification. He picked up his gavel. The petition to dissolve this marriage is denied. James and Nashoda Holloway remain legally married under territorial law. This court further rules that their marriage represents a valid legal union entitled to all protections and recognitions afforded to any married couple. The gavel came down with finality. For a moment there was stunned silence. Then the room erupted in cheers and protests, roughly equal in volume. James pulled Nashoda into his arms, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. She was trembling, tears streaming down her face for the first time since he'd known her. We won, she whispered. We actually won. You won, James corrected. That speech, you changed his mind. We won, she repeated firmly. Together. As they left the town hall, Dutch Keller blocked their path, his face purple with rage. "This ain't over," he spat. "Drake won't be judged forever. Eventually, you'll realize you wasted your life hating people for being different," Nashota said calmly. "That seems punishment enough. Excuse us." She walked past him without another glance, James at her side, and Dutch could only watch them go, his impotent anger achieving nothing. That evening, the Holloways hosted a celebration at their ranch. Nearly 70 people came, everyone who'd supported them, plus some who'd been neutral but were won over by the judge's decision. Tables were laden with food, lanterns were strung between the barn and house, and Ben Tucker brought his fiddle. As the sun set and stars emerged, James stood with Nashota under the cottonwood tree they'd planted their first spring together. The tree had grown tall and strong, its branches spreading wide, offering shade and shelter. "We did it," James said, still hardly believing it. "We actually built something that couldn't be taken away." "Not easily anyway," Nashota corrected with a slight smile. "There will always be people like Dutch Keller, always be battles to fight." "And we'll fight them," James said firmly. "Together." "Together," Nashota agreed, kissing him softly. They'd come so far from that February night when she'd stumbled frozen to his mountain cabin. Two outcasts who'd found in each other what the world tried to deny them: belonging, purpose, love, and the legal right to claim all of it. The future would bring new challenges, they both knew that. But they'd face those challenges the same way they'd faced everything else, with courage, partnership, and the unshakable knowledge that what they'd built together was worth fighting for. Their story wasn't over, it was just beginning. 2 years after Judge Drake's ruling, in the spring of 1879, Nashota discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for weeks but waited to be certain before telling James. The signs were unmistakable: the morning nausea that passed by midday, the exhaustion that hit her unexpectedly, the subtle changes in her body that she recognized from helping other women through their pregnancies. On a warm May evening, as they sat on the porch watching the horses graze in the twilight, she finally spoke the words. "James, I'm carrying a child." He went absolutely still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Then he set it down carefully and turned to face her, his eyes wide with a mixture of joy and terror. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. About 3 months along, I think. The baby should come in late October or early November." James reached for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "How do you feel? Are you well? Should you be working? We need to get you to a doctor." "James," Nashota interrupted gently, squeezing his hand. "I'm fine. Pregnancy isn't an illness. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "But you're—" He stopped, trying to find the right words. "You're important. You matter. I can't lose you." And there it was, the fear beneath the joy. Anna had died pregnant. The memory of that loss, though softened by time, still lived in him. Nashota pulled him close, resting his head against her shoulder. "I'm strong, James. Stronger than most women. And I'll have good care. Dr. Helen Foster is excellent. And Ruth Morrison has delivered half the babies in Copper Springs. I'm not Anna. This isn't the same situation." "I know," James said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I know that, but I'm still terrified." "So am I," Nashota admitted. "But I'm also happy. We're going to have a child, James, a piece of both of us, carrying both our worlds forward." He pulled back to look at her face, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "Our baby," she confirmed, smiling. The pregnancy progressed without major complications. Dr. Helen Foster, a physician who'd come west from Boston to practice frontier medicine, examined Nashota monthly and declared her remarkably healthy. You have the constitution of an ox, Foster said approvingly after one examination. Strong bones, good muscle tone, excellent overall health. If all my patients were built like you, I'd be out of work. But as Nashoda's condition became visible, new complications emerged, not medical, but social. Some townspeople who'd accepted the Holloways' marriage found the prospect of their child more troubling. The abstract idea of a mixed marriage was one thing. The concrete reality of a mixed-race child was another. "It ain't right," Martha Simmons declared loudly in the general store one afternoon when Nashoda was shopping. "Bringing a half-breed child into the world. That child won't belong nowhere, won't be accepted by neither whites nor Apache." Nashoda turned to face the woman, her hand resting protectively on her swelling belly. "My child will belong exactly where any child belongs, with parents who love them and a community willing to accept them. Whether your community chooses to be that community is up to you, Mrs. Simmons." "Well, I never—" "Yes, you have," Nashoda interrupted calmly. "You've been saying things like this since the day I arrived in Copper Springs. It hasn't changed who I am or what I've accomplished. It won't change who my child becomes." She completed her purchases and left, but the encounter troubled her more than she admitted to James, not because she doubted herself, but because she worried about the world their child would face. That evening she shared her concerns with Ruth Morrison, who'd become something of a mentor and mother figure to her. "A child shouldn't have to fight for acceptance from birth," Nashoda said, sipping the tea Ruth had prepared. "Shouldn't have to prove their worth before they're old enough to understand why it's being questioned." "No child should," Ruth agreed, "but many do. Children of poverty, children with disabilities, children who look different or think different, they all face battles. Your child will face theirs. But they'll also have something many don't have: parents who understand struggle, who've fought their own battles and won. Parents who can teach them to be strong without being bitter, proud without being defensive. And if that's not enough, then we make it enough," Ruth said firmly. "Those of us who support you, who've watched you build something remarkable despite opposition, we'll make sure your child knows they're valued. The Martha Simmonses of the world will always exist, but so will people like me, like Sheriff Wade, like the Chens and Ben Tucker and dozens of others who judge people by their character rather than their heritage." Nashoda felt tears prick her eyes. Pregnancy had made her more emotional than she was accustomed to. "Thank you, Ruth, for everything, for seeing me as a person from the beginning. Thank you for proving that my judgment was sound," Ruth replied with a warm smile. As summer deepened and Nashoda's pregnancy became more pronounced, James became increasingly protective. He tried to prevent her from doing heavy work, insisted she rest more, worried constantly about her health. "I can still train horses," Nashoda said with exasperation after James had forbidden her from working with a particularly spirited young mare. "I'm pregnant, not fragile. That mare could kick, you could fall, the baby—" "We'll be fine. I'm careful, James. I'm not taking foolish risks." She softened her tone. "I understand you're frightened, but you can't wrap me in cotton wool for 6 more months. I need to work. I need to feel useful." They compromised. Nashoda continued training horses, but avoided the most unpredictable ones. She still managed the trading post accounts, but let others handle the heavy lifting. She maintained her normal activities while accepting reasonable precautions. Thomas Cole, now 19 and thoroughly devoted to the Holloways, appointed himself Nashoda's unofficial guardian. He materialized whenever she was doing anything remotely strenuous, ready to take over the task. "Thomas, I can carry a saddle," Nashoda protested when he intercepted her for the 3rd time in one morning. "Yes, ma'am, but you don't need to when I'm here," he replied cheerfully, taking the saddle from her hands. Besides, Mr. Holloway said, "Mr. Holloway worries too much." "Yes, ma'am, but I work for him, so I'm going to keep worrying right alongside him." Despite her protests, Nashota was secretly touched by the care surrounding her. She'd spent so much of her life being seen as too strong, too capable, too independent to need help. Being cared for, even when it occasionally felt excessive, was a new experience. In August, a letter arrived from Fort Apache. It was addressed to Nashota in careful handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a message from her mother's sister, an aunt she'd met only a handful of times. The letter explained that word had reached the Apache community about Nashota's marriage and pregnancy. The aunt wanted Nashota to know that while some Apache disapproved of her marrying a white man, others remembered her mother fondly and wished her well. The aunt offered traditional blessings for the pregnancy and included a small beaded charm meant to protect mother and child during birth. Nashota sat on the porch, turning the charm over in her hands, tears streaming down her face. James found her there and immediately knelt beside her in concern. "What's wrong? Bad news?" "No," Nashota managed, showing him the letter. "Good news. My mother's sister. She's blessing the baby. She doesn't condemn me for marrying you." James read the letter, then pulled Nashota into his arms. "Your mother's people haven't forgotten you." "Some of them haven't," Nashota corrected. "But some have. Some see me as a traitor for choosing this life." "And what do you see yourself as?" Nashota wiped her eyes and thought carefully before answering. "I see myself as someone who chose to build a life that honored both parts of my heritage. My mother taught me to be strong, resourceful, and connected to the land. My father taught me to be educated, business-minded, and engaged with American society. You've taught me that I can be all of those things at once, that I don't have to choose one world over another." She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. "And our child will carry all of that forward: Apache strength and wisdom, American opportunity and education, and the knowledge that love can bridge any divide." "That's a heavy burden for one small person," James observed. "Maybe, but they won't carry it alone. They'll have us, and they'll have this community we've built around us. Imperfect, sometimes difficult, but ultimately supportive." As October approached, preparations intensified. Dr. Foster examined Nashota weekly, monitoring the baby's position and Nashota's health. Ruth Morrison organized a group of women to ensure the Holloways had everything they'd need: baby clothes sewn by skilled hands, a cradle built by Ben Tucker, blankets and diapers, and all the practical necessities of infant care. Even some women who'd been cool toward Nashota softened during this time. Pregnancy and childbirth created a sisterhood that transcended other divisions. Women who'd never invited Nashota to their social gatherings now stopped by the ranch to offer advice, share their own birth stories, and provide the kind of support that only other mothers could give. "You'll want to walk as much as possible in the final weeks," advised Elizabeth Wade, the sheriff's wife, during one visit. "Helps the baby position properly, and have James rub your back. The ache gets terrible toward the end." "Don't listen to anyone who tells you there's one right way to do things," added Sarah Chen. "Every birth is different. Trust your body and Dr. Foster and you'll be fine." The baby came on a cold November night, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Nashota's labor started just after supper, a tightening in her belly that she initially dismissed as the false contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. But these didn't fade. They grew stronger, more regular, unmistakably real. "James," she said calmly, though her heart was racing, "I need you to fetch Dr. Foster. The baby's coming." James went pale but moved immediately, saddling his fastest horse and riding hard for town. He returned within the hour with Dr. Foster, Ruth Morrison, and Elizabeth Wade, all carrying bags of supplies. The women took over with practiced efficiency, setting up the bedroom, boiling water, preparing clean linens. James was banished to the main room, where Sheriff Wade and Thomas Cole had arrived to keep him company and prevent him from pacing a hole in the floor. "First babies take time," Wade said, though his own nerves showed in how he kept checking his pocket watch. "Could be hours yet." It was hours, long, difficult hours during which James listened to sounds from the bedroom that made him want to break down the door and demand to be let in. But Ruth Morrison had been firm. "You'll just be in the way, and Nashota needs to focus. Trust us to care for her." Near dawn, after a night that felt eternal, a new sound emerged, the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn baby. James was on his feet instantly, his heart hammering. The bedroom door opened and Ruth emerged, smiling broadly despite her exhaustion. "You have a daughter," she announced. "A beautiful, healthy daughter, and Nashota came through it like the warrior she is." James pushed past her into the bedroom. Nashota lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was a tiny, perfect human being. "Come meet your daughter," Nashota said softly. James approached as if in a dream, hardly daring to breathe. The baby was small, impossibly small, with a cap of dark hair and skin the color of honey. Her eyes were closed, her tiny fists waving in the air as she made small, snuffling sounds. "Can I hold her?" James asked, his voice breaking. Nashota carefully transferred the bundle into his arms. The baby weighed almost nothing, felt fragile as porcelain, and James was terrified he might somehow break her just by holding her wrong. But then she opened her eyes, dark like her mother's, and looked directly at him, and James felt his entire world reorganize around this tiny person. "Hello," he whispered. "I'm your father. I've been waiting to meet you." The baby yawned, unimpressed by this declaration, and James laughed through tears he didn't realize he was crying. "What should we name her?" Nashota asked. They'd discussed names for months but never settled on one. Now, looking at his daughter, James knew exactly what felt right. "Hope," he said. "Her name should be Hope, because that's what she represents. Hope for the future. Hope that different worlds can come together and create something beautiful." Nashota smiled. "Hope Holloway, I love it." Dr. Foster completed her examination, pronounced both mother and baby healthy, and left detailed instructions for the coming weeks. The other women departed as well, leaving the new family alone with their daughter as the sun rose over the ranch. James sat beside the bed, Hope sleeping in his arms, Nashota's hand in his, and felt a completeness he'd never imagined possible. 5 years ago, he'd been a broken man hiding in the mountains, convinced his life was over. Now he had a wife he loved, a successful ranch, a place in a community, and a daughter who represented the future. "Thank you," he said to Nashota. "For what?" "For stumbling into my cabin during a blizzard, for refusing to let me waste away in isolation, for building this life with me, for giving me hope." He smiled at the double meaning. "You gave me just as much," Nashota replied. "A place to belong, work that matters, love that accepts all of who I am. We gave each other a future." Hope stirred in James's arms, making small sounds that might have been contentment or hunger, or just the random noises of a newborn. He looked down at her, marveling at her perfection, the tiny fingers, the delicate features, the peaceful expression. "She's going to face challenges," Nashota said quietly. "Being neither fully white nor fully Apache, people will question where she belongs. Then we'll teach her that she belongs exactly where she is," James replied firmly. "That she gets to define herself, not let others define her. That being different isn't a weakness. It's a strength that makes her uniquely suited to bridge worlds." "You sound very certain." I am certain, because she has you as a mother, the strongest, most capable woman I've ever known. She'll learn from your example how to face prejudice with dignity, how to succeed despite obstacles, how to claim her place in the world. And she has you as a father, Nashota countered. She'll learn from you how to love deeply, how to change and grow, how to see value in people others overlook. They sat together in the morning light, their daughter sleeping peacefully, the ranch awakening around them. Outside, horses moved in their paddock. In town, the trading post would open for business. The world continued its rhythms, but inside this room, everything had changed. A new life had entered the world, a child who carried in her blood the legacy of two peoples, two worlds, two people who'd found each other against all odds. Hope Holloway was more than just a baby. She was a promise that different worlds could unite, that love could overcome prejudice, that the future didn't have to repeat the divisions of the past. She was, in every way that mattered, a child of hope, and her parents would spend the rest of their lives making sure she knew it. Hope Holloway turned 2 years old in November of 1881, and Copper Springs had never seen a child quite like her. She'd inherited her mother's height, already taller than most children her age, and her father's light brown hair that caught golden in the sun. Her skin was the warm amber of perfectly mixed heritage, and her eyes were dark and intelligent, missing nothing. She was strong, fearless, and possessed of a stubborn independence that both delighted and exhausted her parents. She climbed onto the paddock fence again, Thomas Cole reported one autumn morning, carrying the muddy toddler into the house. I turned my back for 30 seconds and she was halfway over, trying to reach the horses. Nashota took her daughter, who was grinning unrepentantly. Hope, we've talked about this. The big horses are too tall for you. Want to ride? Hope declared, her vocabulary expanding daily. When you're bigger, James promised, coming in from the barn. Right now, you're too small. Not small, Hope protested indignantly. Big girl. This was a constant refrain. Hope was convinced she was old enough to do everything the adults did. Ride horses, train colts, help at the trading post, work in the garden. Her determination to keep up with parents who were both exceptionally capable meant she was constantly attempting tasks beyond her years. But she was also undeniably charming. Her mix of Nashota's fierce independence and James's gentle kindness won over even the townspeople who'd initially been skeptical about a mixed-race child in Copper Springs. Mrs. Patricia Daniels, who ran the boarding house and had once been cool toward the Holloways, had completely softened after Hope toddled up to her one day and declared, "Pretty lady." Patricia now kept peppermint sticks specifically for Hope's visits to town. Even Sheriff Wade, gruff and practical, melted when Hope insisted on helping him feed his horse, earnestly offering the animal handfuls of grass she'd pulled herself. That child could charm a rattlesnake, Wade observed to James one afternoon. She gets that from her mother, James replied, watching Hope carefully brush the sheriff's horse under Nashota's supervision. As Hope grew through her early years, so did the ranch. By 1885, the Holloways owned over 200 acres and employed 6 permanent workers. Their specially trained mountain horses had earned a reputation across 3 territories, and buyers traveled from as far as Colorado to purchase their stock. The trading post partnership had flourished as well. Nashota now owned half the business outright, and under her management it had become the most successful mercantile operation in the region. She'd established supply contracts with mining companies, negotiated fair trade agreements with Apache communities, and created a business model that proved profitability and ethics weren't mutually exclusive. But their greatest success wasn't measured in acres or profits. It was measured in the community they'd helped build. On a warm May evening in 1885, 6 years after Hope's birth, the town of Copper Springs gathered for its annual spring festival. The event had grown from a small local celebration into a major regional gathering that drew people from settlements across central Arizona territory. James stood with Nashota at the edge of the celebration, watching Hope, now nearly 4 years old, dance with other children around the maypole that had been erected in the town square. The music came from Ben Tucker's fiddle, accompanied by drums played by Apache visitors from Fort Apache who'd traveled to participate in the trading fair that coincided with the festival. "Do you see that?" Nashota said quietly, gesturing to the scene before them. James followed her gaze. Apache families mingled with white settlers. Mexican traders laughed with American merchants. Children of every background played together without apparent consciousness of the differences that divided their parents' generation. 10 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible, Nashota continued. The communities were separate, suspicious of each other. Now they gather voluntarily to celebrate together. "You did that," James said. "Your trading post created the connections. Your fairness built the trust." "We did that," Nashota corrected. "You trained horses for Apache riders when other ranchers refused to sell to them. You hired workers based on skill rather than heritage. You stood beside me when it would have been easier to distance yourself." James pulled her close, heedless of who might be watching. "Standing beside you has been the easiest choice I've ever made." Sheriff Wade approached, his weathered face creased in a smile. "Holloway's got someone who wants to meet you." He gestured to a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, well-dressed in the style of Eastern businessmen, who stepped forward with hand extended. "Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, I'm Richard Brennan from the Territorial Development Commission. I've been hearing remarkable things about your operations here." Over the next hour, Brennan explained that the territorial government was studying successful models of community integration and economic development. Copper Springs, and specifically the Holloway's businesses, had been identified as exemplary cases. "What you've built here goes beyond commerce," Brennan said. "You've created economic interdependence between communities that historically viewed each other as competitors or threats. Apache families sell goods through your trading post. White settlers purchase horses you've trained using Apache methods. Mexican merchants find markets you've connected them to. Everyone benefits, so everyone cooperates." "It's just good business," Nashota said simply. "Exclusion limits your market. Inclusion expands it." "It's brilliant business," Brennan corrected. "And it's created something remarkable, a genuinely integrated community where people prosper together rather than in spite of each other." He paused, then continued with obvious excitement. "The territorial governor wants to use Copper Springs as a model. We're proposing to establish similar trading post and training operations in other settlements, using your methods as the template. We'd need your consultation, your expertise, potentially your direct involvement in establishing these operations." James and Nashota exchanged glances, communicating silently in the way long-married couples develop. "We'd need to discuss details," Nashota said carefully. "Our daughter is young. Our existing businesses require attention, but we're interested in hearing more." Brennan smiled broadly. "Excellent. I'll be in Copper Springs through the week. We can discuss terms, compensation, the scope of involvement you'd be comfortable with." After he left, James turned to Nashota with wonder in his eyes. "The territorial government wants to replicate what we've built. They're asking us to help shape policy across Arizona territory." "It's overwhelming," Nashota admitted. 10 years ago, I was a woman with no home, no family, no prospects. Now the territorial government wants my expertise." "You earned it, every bit of it." That evening, as the festival continued around them, they sat together watching Hope play with her friends, children whose parents represented every community in the region. The little girl moved between groups with easy confidence, switching languages as needed, comfortable in all worlds because she'd been taught she belonged in all of them. "Do you remember," James said quietly, "that night in my mountain cabin when you asked if I'd ever known a woman's touch?" Nashota smiled at the memory. "You looked terrified." "I was, not of you, of feeling anything again, of letting anyone close enough to matter." He took her hand. "You saved my life that night, Nashota, not just by giving me something to live for, but by teaching me how to live again." "You saved mine too," she replied. "You saw me as a person when most people saw only what made me different. You gave me space to be fully myself, all the contradictions and complications. That's the greatest gift anyone's ever given me." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter and the community they'd helped build. Around them, the festival continued, music and laughter and the easy mingling of people who'd learned that cooperation created more prosperity than division. Ruth Morrison approached, her aged face beaming with pride. She'd retired from active management of the trading post, but remained a beloved figure in Copper Springs. "I wanted you both to know something," Ruth said, settling onto the bench beside them. "Caleb and I have been in this territory for 35 years. We've seen communities grow and fail, seen people build and destroy. What you've created here in Copper Springs, the integration, the mutual respect, the genuine cooperation, it's the finest thing we've witnessed in all those years." She reached out and squeezed Nashota's hand. "That first day you walked into my trading post, I took a chance on you because you seemed competent. I had no idea you'd transform not just the business but the entire community. You've proven that different backgrounds aren't barriers to success. They're assets that create strength through diversity." "Thank you, Ruth," Nashota said, her voice thick with emotion, "for that first chance, for believing in me when you had no reason to." "I had every reason," Ruth replied firmly. "You just needed someone to see it." As Ruth returned to the festival, James reflected on how far they'd come. 9 years ago, he'd been a broken hermit convinced his life was over. Nashota had been a desperate woman fleeing through a blizzard, belonging nowhere. Now they owned a prosperous ranch, co-managed a successful trading post, were raising a remarkable daughter, and were being asked to help shape territorial policy. But the greatest measure of their success wasn't wealth or influence. It was visible in the community around them, in the Apache elder teaching white children traditional basket weaving, in the Mexican merchant negotiating cheerfully with American miners, in the children of every heritage playing together with unself-conscious ease. Hope ran up to them, breathless and excited. "Mama, Papa, Mrs. Chen is teaching us a Chinese dance. Can I learn it?" "Of course," Nashota said, smiling. "Will you watch?" "We'll watch everything," James promised. Hope ran back to join the group of children attempting to follow Sarah Chen's patient instruction in traditional Chinese dance movements. She stumbled, laughed, tried again with the resilience that characterized her approach to all challenges. "She's going to change the world," Nashota said softly, watching their daughter. "She already is," James replied, "just by being herself, by showing that different heritages can unite in one person and create something stronger than either alone." As the sun set over Copper Springs, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the festival continued. Music drifted on the evening air, fiddle and drum and guitar blending into something new and beautiful, reflecting the community that created it. James Holloway, once a man so broken he'd hidden from the world, now sat surrounded by friends and community, his hand clasped in his wife's, watching their daughter embody the future they'd fought to build. Nashota Hayes Holloway, once a woman rejected by both her worlds, now sat as a respected leader, whose vision had transformed an entire region, proving that strength came from embracing all of who you are rather than denying any part. And Hope Holloway, carrying in her blood and spirit the legacy of two peoples, danced in the twilight with children from every background, completely unaware that she was revolutionary simply by existing, living proof that love could bridge any divide, that different worlds could unite, that the future didn't have to repeat the divisions of the past. 10 years earlier, a frozen woman had stumbled to a mountain cabin during a blizzard and asked a hermit if he'd ever known a woman's touch. That question had changed 2 lives, created a family, built a business empire, and helped transform a divided territory into a model of integration and cooperation. The blizzard had long since passed, but what it brought, 2 broken people who found healing in each other, who built something beautiful from their shared strength that endured, and would endure for generations to come, carried forward by children like Hope and communities like Copper Springs, proving that the most powerful force in any territory wasn't gold or land or law. It was the courage to see value in people others overlooked, the willingness to build bridges instead of walls, the conviction that love and partnership could overcome any obstacle. That was the legacy of James and Nashotah Holloway. That was the story Copper Springs would tell for 100 years, not as a fairy tale, but as truth lived and proven. 2 outcasts who found each other in a storm and built a future that welcomed everyone. That was worth everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.